So in the last video in this series, I made a chemise, which is the primary undergarment for my 1840s ensemble to go to the ball in Bath. And I could have just stopped here with the undergarments. It was very common in this era for a chemise to be the only undergarment women wore, but you could also have a pair of bloomers, or as the Victorians called them, drawers. But that was very much up to sort of personal preference, if you like, and they're much less common in this 1840s era than they are towards the end of the 19th century. However, many of my friends and colleagues who were also going to the ball, and in fact many of you in the comments, had recommended that I make a pair of bloomers, as it makes visiting the loo while wearing all those many layers and enormous skirts much easier than wearing modern underwear, and it's preferable to the other historically accurate option, which is going commando. I also knew that as somebody with mobility and balance issues, and I was going to an event that was hopefully going to involve some dancing for me, there was a very high likelihood that I was going to fall flat on my face. And I would also be doing things like clambering in and out of the back of an Uber, which is difficult for me at the best of times, never mind with all the skirts. And I would be in a very busy city centre. So I decided I wanted just a bit more coverage. So I just used the same pattern that I already had for the chemise, Simplicity 1139. It looked pretty straightforward. There were only 3 pattern pieces, and I had enough leftover cotton in my stash from a different project that I could use for this. It was heavier weight than the cotton lawn that I used for the chemise, but not so heavy as a quilting cotton. So, should we get started?
The pattern piece for the leg of the bloomers was so big I couldn't fit it on my cutting table, so I had to pin it in 2 halves, cutting as much as would fit on the table before shifting everything up to pin the rest of the pattern piece on and cut out the bottom of the leg. The smaller pattern pieces had to be cut from the offcuts from the massive leg piece, so I sat down to pin them on and cut them out, being as economical with the fabric as I could. I had learnt my lesson from the chemise that skipping the marking up really doesn't save any time, because I knew I would just end up sewing something wrong later when I couldn't make sense of the instructions. This did mean I had to wear the bloomers covered in yellow marks, but guess what? Nobody noticed. I started by joining the waistband pieces. The instructions have you leave a little gap in the seam to thread a cord through later. Then I joined the inside leg seams on the leg of the bloomers, making sure to match the balance marks. This was the only seam for the legs, so this went pretty quickly. Then I pressed open all the seams. The inside leg seam was slightly curved, so it was a little tricky, but using my sleeve board really helped. You might have noticed no seam finish yet. We'll come to that next. I wanted to do flat felled seams for the bloomers. It seemed the neatest, strongest and quickest way to finish the raw edges, so I trimmed down one side of the seam allowance on the inside leg seam, pressed the other half so that it lay over the trimmed half, and then carefully folded the seam allowance over to enclose the trimmed edge before carefully pressing it in place. This was still fiddly, but I was using a heavier, firmer cotton for the bloomers, so it was less fiddly than the flat felt seams I'd done on the lightweight cotton lawn of the chemise. Once pressed, I pinned the seam allowance in place before continuing down the length of the seam. It was trickiest where the seam began to curve sharply. I had to sort of ease in the excess fabric to keep everything smooth, but when it was all pinned in place, I set the legs aside to press under the seam allowance for the waistband. As usual, batching my tasks here. I already had the iron out and hot, so I pressed everything I could before moving back to my sewing machine. So I began by joining the 2 pieces of the waistband together, leaving the bottom edge open to attach the bloomers. Then it was time to top stitch the flat felt seams. Now it's very difficult to sew a vertical line down a tube on a sewing machine because you can't really get it under the needle without catching the other side. I was only able to flat fell this seam by machine because the circumference of the leg on these bloomers was so wide I could bunch all the fabric up and still have room to sew. It wasn't the easiest seam to sew, but it was worth it. To decorate the bottom edge of the bloomers, I made a little ruffle out of some embroidery anglaise I've had in my stash for over 10 years, joining it into a cuff with a flat felt seam and using a long stitch length to sew a gathering thread around the top edge.
I've done something really dumb. When I measured the amount of lace I needed for the cuffs, I measured across like this and I doubled it and then I cut the lace that size. So I didn't put any, you're supposed to like double or 2.5 times the circumference of the cuff to get the ruffle. Oh my God, what an idiot. I went to put this on. Guess what? It gathered down like this much. Oh. So after beautifully flat fell seaming this, I'm unpicking.
So I cut some more of the embroidery anglaise and I did another beautiful little flat felled seam to join the two previous pieces together before trimming down the curved edge to become a straight one and running gathering stitches along the now long enough to actually gather top edge.
So another dilemma I'm facing with applying this trim is that it said to match the raw edges and stitch at 5/8 of an inch, but that will mean I catch the top of my little embroidered flowers here. So I'm having to offset it ever so slightly so that that doesn't happen. Oh, I suppose I should go like this and match the halfway point and all of that. That'll do. It's approximate, but oh well. I've only got one gathering thread, so I'll have to be very careful. I think their trim was probably wider than mine, so I don't know how this is going to look, but oh well, we're doing it.
After much fiddling with the gathers, I could then machine the gathered lace onto the bottom of the cuff. This still involved lots of fiddling to get the gathers to lay nicely, and I wasn't entirely sure I was going to like the way this looked when finished. With the lace on, I turned the raw edges to the wrong side and pressed the lace down so that the raw edges were poking up inside the leg of the bloomer. I then decided to use one of the decorative stitches on my machine to hold the raw edges in place and hopefully prevent fraying. The sewing pattern didn't give satisfactory instructions for this bit, so this was just my own interpretation based on some original examples I've seen. Naturally, the historically accurate way would be to use a decorative hand stitch, but I couldn't be bothered with that.
Can you see it?
I did some samples to make sure I liked the way it looked and played around with the stitch length before sewing the seam allowance in place with that stitch. I then joined the two legs of the bloomers together at the crotch until the balance mark. These are open drawers, meaning most of the crotch seam isn't attached, one of the few historical accuracies of this pattern. The rest of the crotch seam and the raw edges of the seamed bit are hemmed by rolling them twice. I pressed and pinned these edges in place before machining them with a straight stitch. No decorative stitch necessary, as hopefully nobody at the ball will be getting close enough to have a good look. I then tacked the pleat at the centre front in place. Before running gathering stitches along the top edge of the bloomers, ready to gather them down to fit in the waistband. The bloomers were stitched onto the half of the waistband that I hadn't pressed under earlier with right sides together. I went slowly to make sure I didn't catch any of the gathers in a weird way, and then I could fold the waistband over to enclose the raw edges. I pressed the seam allowance up into the waistband and then pressed the waistband down over the seam so that the folded under edge matched the stitching line of the seam. This then got pinned in place so I could machine it in place. I used my top stitching foot as I knew I wanted a visible top stitch rather than a stitch in the ditch. Yes, you get visible stitching, but it's faster and more secure. I then had to machine a channel for the drawstring ties to run through, but only on the back half of the waistband. Using a safety pin on one end, I threaded a length of narrow cotton twill tape through the openings I had left when making up the waistband, from one end of the back panel to the other. Only this proved really tricky to get out again because of the seam allowances.
As well, I literally could have sewn this into the seam when I was doing it. Oh my god, finally.
I then had to machine the end of that tape in place after poking it through the opening to the inside of the waistband. I ended up pivoting around it to make a little square of stitching for strength, as the tape seemed likely to fray under tension. It turned out I actually sewed the tape on the right side, but oh well, the bloomers were done.
Fuck it.
Much like the chemise, I don't really have much to say about these bloomers. I'm glad I made them, and I was surprised by how accurate and usable this simplicity pattern was. But I hope that if you're new to costuming and relying on these often questionable Big Four patterns, seeing someone with my experience struggling to make sense of the instructions helped you realise it's not you. I still think this was a quicker and more energy efficient option for me, despite my struggles. The bloomers and chemise came together in just a few days, and if you don't have to take as many breaks as I do, you could probably put them together over a few evenings. Most importantly, it's a start. I'm on my way, and now for the real challenge, the corset. Thanks for watching. See you next time.